Welcome everybody to our special virtual session on specific aims for independent awards. My name is Scott Denstaedt. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Michigan, and I'm happy for you all to join us. I'm also looking forward to this session. I'm just going to talk real quick, give you an overview of the agenda for today. So we're going to start off with a few didactics, one from Dr. Sheppard on kind of understanding when you're ready to submit an R01. A didactic by Dr. Ridge in terms of how to specifically write a specific games page, no pun intended, and then a Q&A session that will facilitate any questions that might arise from those two didactics, as well as a perspective from Dr. Wilson, who's one of our faculty panelists as well. We will split off into small groups for a little while and review a specific aims page. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get those out to you beforehand. I will put them in the chat when I'm done talking, so keep a lookout for the specific aims pages that we're going to review. The one that we're going to review is the _edit version, and then we're going to review the _original version as well, but primarily the _edit. And then following those small groups, we will come back and answer any additional questions in a panel format. I do want to thank our faculty participants. Dr. Ridge is a professor of medicine at Northwestern University and a research program focusing on intermediate filaments and the role in viral infections. Dr. Sheppard, who's a professor of medicine and division chief at pulmonary care at UCSF, whose research focuses on integrins and their role in acute lung injury and fibrosis. Dr. Wilson, who's an associate professor pulmonary critical care medicine at Boston University, whose research focuses on COPD, more specifically alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, and is also a director of the Alpha-1 Foundation Research Program. I want to thank our additional ECP working group members, Maria Basil from the University of Pennsylvania, Yan Hu from University of Colorado, Joe Bednash from The Ohio State University, and then of course our ATS liaison, Tiana Lino, who helped put this together. So with no further ado, we will get to Dr. Sheppard's. I'll stop sharing and you can go ahead and get us started.
For inviting me, I just want to clarify that I'm no longer the division chief or director of anything, which I'm happy about. So I'm just running
my mistake
and working on trying to write R01 grants of my own. So basically, I'll just start off asking this challenging question that people always ask about whether you're ready or when you're actually ready to write an R01 grant. And I kind of put it more into a perspective of where you are at in your career development. So ideally, you should try to write your first R01 grant, I think, within 2 to 3 years of starting a career development award. So either a K or a Burroughs Wellcome or Parker B. Francis. And the reason for trying to aim for that kind of a relatively aggressive goal is it sometimes takes a little while to get your first R01 grant, and you're going to learn a lot from the process of submitting. And if you don't really set aggressive goals, sometimes time slips by and you end up not applying until a time when you might be much more desperate to need the funding. And certainly you want to build in a lot of flexibility for yourself so that you don't end up feeling pressured to abandon part of your research program and pursue more clinical time or other things that are going to make it more difficult. So it's good, but I think not absolutely required to have a first authored paper that forms the basis for your R01 grant application. And I've certainly seen many people at our own institution who had a very well-developed story with lots of data and were able to get funding for their R01 grant in an area that they hadn't yet published a first authored paper on. But certainly it's ideal if you have been able to do that. And then I also think it's important to put in perspective what you'll ultimately need to run an effective long-term successful research program. And you really ought to aim for trying to, over time, have at least 2 R01 or R01 equivalents with non-overlapping end dates. And so you can use that long-term thought, as one of the ways to decide what you're going to make the topic of your first R01 grant. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So yeah, actually, I'm coming back to it right now, which is this question: when you started your own research lab, your own independent program, which grant should you submit? And I'm asking the question that way because I think it's really important for anybody starting their own independent lab to try to build at least two independent projects with different timescales into their plans, because you really don't know in advance which project is going to be successful enough first to lead to a successful R01 grant. And you want to have more than one opportunity to do this. So I would suggest that even when you've just gotten your K or Burroughs Wellcome Award, you're just starting your lab, try to think about building a lab with this goal in mind, to have more than one independent project that you could potentially make an R01 grant about when it's sufficiently mature. So that's what I kind of just alluded to. When you're actually ready, when you're deciding to submit your first R01 grant, you want to choose the project that's most mature and the least risky for you. So that's something that you already have. It might not be the most exciting, ambitious goal that you eventually want to achieve, but you want to pick an area where there's already sufficient reason from the literature and your own data to suggest that the project you're proposing is likely to be successful and important. And the other thing I think it's really important when you're starting your own independent group is not to consider including a project in somebody else's program project grant or other multi-project grant until after your first R01 grant is secure. That's important for a number of reasons. One of them is, probably the most important, is you want to build your lab around something that you control. And a program project grant or multi-project grant, other people's inability to be successful could lead to long-term failure to succeed. And also, there's another really important issue, which is if you're applying for your first grant, ideally you qualify for the bonus that you'll get from being an early stage investigator, and you give that up if you put your exciting project into a program project grant. So it's not being selfish. It's in everybody's interest in your division and in our field that you be successful and start a sustainable lab. And so you should avoid folding projects early on into a program project grant. So if you're honest, you'll never feel completely ready to submit any grant. And we all know that any area of research that you're doing is going to get more mature all the time. There'll always be more data. It could always be better. So just start understanding that to begin with, and pick times that you have to apply for, or that you will, or you need to apply for grants, recognizing that you don't think the project is as great as it might be sometime in the future. So if you're an early stage investigator, which is called ESI, that means you're within 10 years of your terminal degree or the end of your clinical training. You can get up to a 10 percentile boost at the NHLBI on the pay line. So it's really an enormous advantage that was set up to help people start their independent careers. And you really want to be sure you take advantage of that. So don't do anything that you could avoid that interferes with your this ESI boost, and that includes don't put in multiple PI grants with other PIs who are don't have ESI status. If you get those grants, you can't use your ESI status for your own independent R01 grant. And the other thing is you need to look at the clock, and that's one of the issues about are you ready? You should have a lower threshold for being ready if you're getting close to the end of your ESI period of time, because it's something that you don't want to miss out on, right? I mean, this year the pay line might be 10%, so you'll basically be doubling the pay line by using this benefit. So you still need sufficient preliminary data and a strong rationale to support a 5-year research program, even if you have ESI status. I mean, the review committees are told they're supposed to cut some slack to early stage investigators, and they do, but it doesn't mean that you can put in a proposal where you neither have a strong preliminary data nor a strong rationale. So really, you just want to be sure that you look at the clock and you time this right so you take advantage of this status. And you clearly need time before you put the R01 grant in to craft a proposal that's tightly focused around a central question with multiple orthogonal approaches that are not dependent on one another. And I'm sure that Karen's going to go into these issues in more detail in her talk. So what are the reasons to apply at a time that you might consider early? Well, one of them is to make your startup run longer. So most of you, hopefully, when you start your own independent lab, have negotiated for some amount of startup funding that, is finite. And when you use it up, it's gone. And then you have to depend entirely on R01 grants for flexibility. So you want to try to protect that startup. And one of the ways you can protect your startup is by getting your own R01 grant funding. Another is to accelerate the pace of building your independent lab. So, even if you have terrific startup, when you get an R01 grant, you have more funds and you're able to hire new people and expand what you're capable of doing. It's also one of the critical steps in trying to develop that long-term goal of having two parallel, at least, projects that could at any given time be possible for funding. And the other thing that I mean by accelerating the pace of building your independent lab is when you write an R01 grant, you need to think very carefully and deeply about the projects you're trying to, or the problems you're trying to address. And it's a great impetus to develop collaborations, try to get help from other people, make connections with people around your institution and around the country or the world. So another reason to apply early is if you've recently published a strong paper that sets you up well to address key unanswered questions. So I would say if you have a strong paper out, no matter where you're at in your career development award, think about building that into an R01 grant. It's not essential, as I said, but it'll certainly make you more competitive. And I actually sort of got to this already, that submitting an R01 grant or writing an R01 grant greatly accelerates the pace with which you establish critical collaborations and also establish key experimental approaches in your lab. So you might be waiting around to do something, but when you start to write your grant, ideally 6 months in advance of the deadline, you're going to be thinking about what are the key experimental methods that I need to use in this grant, and it gives you time to develop preliminary data about your experience with doing that. So what are the reasons to wait? So one of them is that you don't really have any compelling preliminary data to support the work that you want to build a grant around, and you see a clear path for that improving over the next few months. So if there's something that you really want to make a centerpiece of your lab, but and you're identifying critical things you might need to do, but they're going to take 2 or 3 years, you still might want to be trying to think about a grant that you could submit that doesn't require those things that are going to take a long time. And another is that you lack critical tools that you're in the process of developing, again, with a ideally short-term time frame. If you're developing tools that are going to be great 2 years from now, you ought to be thinking about crafting an R01 grant that doesn't require those tools. And then this is one I've never really heard of, but I guess if you really think you have sufficient startup that you can afford to wait, that might be a reason to wait. But generally, if you can get grant funding and not have to spend a penny of your startup, that'll set you up long term for dealing with unpredictable contingencies that happen during your research career. And that'll also put you in a position where you're much more willing to take risks. So, I would never actually use this reason to wait. I think combining grants and startup is perfect, and that sets you up later on because we know that, ideas and grants go up and down so that you can weather some of these contingencies yourself. So whenever you apply, you need to leave enough time to do the job right. And that means begin writing your specific aims at least 6 months before your planned submission. Leave at least 1 to 2 months for your mentor, colleagues, not directly familiar with your research to provide feedback. and establish networks where you read other people's grants and they read yours. But in order for those networks to work, you have to do these things well in advance. So that's actually all I had to say, and I'll stop sharing and pass this over to Karen.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Fantastic. All right, well, it's a real pleasure to be here. So I just want to give a quick overview of what I'm going to speak about today. And it's going to begin with an introduction to the grant review process. And you might be scratching your head like, why would that be important? But I think it's critical to know who you're writing for. And then a few tools to help you write, and hopefully we'll have enough questions or enough time to go through some questions. So the reason why I like to focus on grant reviewing before we talk about grant writing is because, when we're writing grants, we're writing for the reviewers. And we really need to understand what the reviewers are used to seeing, what they want to see, and the criteria by which they're going to judge your grant. And in order to do this, you have to make your work as simply communicated as you possibly can. And you have to convince the reviewers that your work is important. And you have to convince the reviewers that what you're doing is something that you can actually conduct, complete, as it relates to those specific aims and to your experimental design. So there's different types of reviewers in every study section panel. There's the expert, which would be somebody who knows as much or more than you do on a particular concept or topic. There's the sophisticated non-expert. There's the skilled scientist who probably knows very little about your specific topic, but is skilled enough to understand where the critical thinking roles are in your grant. And then there's the technical expert, the one that I fear the most, particularly biostatisticians and computational analysts. But the most important thing you really need to understand is that you just need to know your reviewers. So check on that study section panel, both the standing study section roster and the ad hocs from the previous couple of cycles, so you know who you're writing to. NIH proposals are really quite scripted, right? So it's our job to come up with a research question and a hypothesis to test that question. And, it doesn't really matter what the idea is, as long as it's in response to the announcement from the NIH. And so the rest of the instructions are really important, because the key thing that I think so many new writers fail to do is to actually read the instructions. I actually try to remind everybody that the whole peer review process begins almost 4 to 5 months after you've submitted your grant. And you're going to get 3 reviewers from that study section. A primary reviewer, this is somebody who's hopefully read your entire grant, from front to back. A secondary reviewer who truly should have read your grant from front to back. And a reader or a third reviewer who we all cross our fingers and hope actually read at least the scientific aspects of your grant. But the thing that we need to remember is that in that study section, there are anywhere from 20 to 25 additional people who are going to be reviewing your grant. So what I just am begging you all to remember that is that when we go through this entire process, there's a lot of eyes on your grant, and some of them have more weight and some of them have less weight in getting you the score you want. And I'll come back to that in just a second. For career development reviews, it's very similar. With, I think, this possible exception. When you're in a K review panel, each section of those K awards is equally weighted. So the career development plan, the actual research proposal, the mentor letter, all of these aspects are equally weighted. So you could really not do so well and still get a very good score on a K-level grant. My experience is that that's not true for R-level grants. That really the things that drive an R-level score are going to be the research proposal and the biosketch. So again, keep those aspects in mind. As you all know, the scoring guideline from the NIH is just simple score, 1 to 9, no decimal points. And when we're sitting in the K study section, we typically begin at a score of 4, which is very good. And we just keep fighting to make that score get better. So what? You got a first author publication, you're now a 3. You've checked all the boxes for the career development plan. I'm really happy to go up another point. The research proposal had a few dinks. I might come back down to a 3. So everybody on the case study section panel is really advocating to get your grant in that high impact category. When you're sitting typically on an R1 study section like LIR or Ribbit or RCM or I'm blanking on the third one, sorry, LCMI. Typically those grants all start at a 5 and they just get worse, right? Because if you think about a 10% effort funding level, you can't get every grant in your stack to be a 1 or a 2. You really have to use that bell curve. So I think it's important to remember that we're all starting in the middle of the pack, and how effectively you write will improve your score or not. So if you don't hear anything else from my part of this talk, I hope you hear this first thing, is that the reviewers that are assigned to your grant are not waking up on a Monday morning after they've had a really refreshing weekend and saying, I'm going to read Scott's grant. No, they're picking up your grant at like 7:30, 8 o'clock at night after they've walked the dog, fought with their husband, and are struggling to get their kids to bed. Which means that it's our job as grant writers to make sure we write the most clear grant that we possibly can, decreasing the amount of non-traditional verbiage and acronyms so that it is a simple grant to read. The next thing that I will just reiterate is that ESI, or the early stage investigator, new investigator, really does have its benefits, because as a reviewer, we're all going to look at your grant just slightly differently. We're going to forgive little mistakes. We're not going to look at the preliminary data more stringently as we would a more senior investigator. So again, people in the room are really advocating for those early stage investigators. I already covered the K grant, so I'm just going to skip that. So let's get into the specific aims, which was my topic. So this is 1-page synopsis of your proposed research. And it's really like a funnel. It's going to set the tone for the rest of your grant. But most importantly, you have to remember that in addition to those 3 reviewers who've hopefully read your entire grant, the other 27 people in the room who get to score your grant, this is typically the only page they read. So if you didn't clearly communicate what you aim to do, what the impact of your grant would be, and what your specific question you're asking and how you're going to answer it, then you're going to really lose, the majority of the room with interest in your application. So again, big message. Remember, this is the only page everybody writes. So we need to be crisp in our writing. Don't waste any words. And let's really get the best first impression that we possibly can. So how do we do that? So the first paragraph in a specific aims page that I refer to when I'm teaching how to write an aims page for my trainees is really to look at a health-related concern. And that's because you have to know where you're submitting your grant to. Assuming that everybody here is going to be submitting to NHLBI, then you absolutely have to have a health-related concern. And then you need the next couple of sentences to really give the background related to that health-related concern and a summary of what's known in the field to this moment in time. And then most important, and the sentence that I often find missing, is the third or the fourth and the last sentence of this paragraph, which is really just defining what's the critical need, what's the knowledge gap, and how is your proposal actually going to fill this knowledge gap. So if we look at this example from a colleague's specific aims page, you can see that in yellow, they've highlighted their health-related concern. They're going to study IPF. They've defined that critical need and that there's no cure for IPF, and the efficacy of the current therapy is limited, and that they defined the knowledge gap that they're going to investigate is by looking at how epithelial cells are going to influence fibroblast activation in IPF, because that's not fully understood. In the second paragraph, we're really looking for the grant writer to tell us what the long-term objective is, right? Because as Dean alluded to, we really want grants that are going to be renewed every 4 to 5 years and keep building upon themselves. So if you're asking a very shallow question, that's going to have a negative or poor influence on your research at large. And then you want to build in the second sentence very succinctly what the premise or the rationale for your grant is. You could mention key pieces of your own preliminary or published work. And then you really want to clearly in bold state your hypothesis that will be alluded to in your specific aims and how you're going to address that. Sometimes there's a little bit of room that you could address your approach, that you're going to use a known mouse model or a novel mouse model, or you're going to combine marine models of injury along with patient samples. But this would be a good time to kind of prompt your reader about what to anticipate in those specific aims and approaches. So when we're looking at that clear hypothesis, you can see from that same specific aims page, this writer wrote that Syndican-1 would promote lung fibrosis through epithelial-derived EVs by controlling the packaging of antifibrotic microRNAs. I think it's a pretty decent hypothesis. I would just say that, if EVs wasn't in your nomenclature, it might be good to write out the word EV in your hypothesis, so anybody who hasn't read your full grant would quickly grasp what you're trying to achieve. When it comes to the specific aims, I think there's two really important things. One, they have to be independent of each other. They can be complementary, but they can't be codependent aims. In other words, if the first aim failed, then there would be no point to do the second aim. And I personally like to have active statements of intent for experiments. I want to see just a very short rationale or remind me what additional preliminary data you might have. And this is a time just to have very brief methods and approaches, as well as the expected outcome. And you might think like, but why do I have to put all that? Because they're going to read my experimental approach. But remember those other 27 people in the room, they have an equal vote as the three primary reviewers. And so you at least want to let them know, like, oh, she's using a genetic lineage trace model, and she's selectively knocking out the gene of interest in the cell of interest, as opposed to using a global knockout mouse, for example. That's very informative to a reviewer who didn't have the opportunity to read your entire proposal. And then again, the same would be true for aim 2, emphasizing that they're independent from the prior aims. The third aim, I think, is really a wonderful opportunity, particularly for young investigators, but truly for everybody, to kind of propose something a little bit more risky or less deterministic, right? So you might have very little preliminary data, or you might be using a very novel method or approach to further advance the hypothesis in a new direction. And I think it would be important, particularly for these more risky hypothesis, to say what the long-term high-reaching expected outcome would be, because everybody would be like, yeah, that's a really great outcome. If it works, I'm willing to see if they can do it, right? So when we go back to look at the first aim of that example specific aims page, you can see that they're using this active statement. They're going to identify the mechanism, so that's fantastic, but they failed to tell me what that expected outcome was in the end. In between, I knew that they were going to use multivesicular endosomes that are going to package their target information, their mRNA, in order to see how they can regulate Syndican. So that was a pretty decent aim 1, in my opinion. Coming back to K-level grants, I think that it's important in a K-level specific aims page that in your overall impact, that you really define how this proposal that you're writing and submitting is going to help you develop your career and address your future goals, because that's going to be key in trying to place your K application in the spectrum of other applications that are being brought forth into the study section. And then again, in that final paragraph for the specific aims page, independent of K awards, would just give that final summary of the overall impact, that if we know Syndican-1 is going to control the microenvironment, then we're going to have a better understanding of how this is going to impact lung fibrosis pathogenesis. So it's kind of that full circle. The first sentence, you told me what the health impact was. And in the last sentence, you're telling me how you're going to actually impact that disease or health-related concern. This is just an example. Sorry, it's out of order of if you were writing again that K grant, but once again, you want to tell that you're trying to become an independent scientist or an independent physician scientist, and how the work for R or K grants would really have an overall impact on the healthcare environment in which you may be working. So that hopefully was informative enough, and I'm happy to stop sharing and proceed to the Q&A session.
Great, thank you so much. Before we get things started with Dr. Wilson's perspective, I just want to mention, Dr. Ridge and Dr. Sheppard, if you're able to put your PowerPoint slides, if you're able and willing to put your PowerPoint slides into the chat so that people can download it, I think that would be useful. Also, I did provide, after I stopped speaking, I provided some files into the chat. Hopefully everyone was able to get those. It should be 2 specific aims pages and 1 how to write specific aims, which was kind of a summary of what Dr. Ridge just presented. If you're not able to see those or didn't get them, just let me know and I'll put them in the chat again. Otherwise, Dr. Wilson, from your perspective, so you're not an early stage investigator, but you're a nearer term to that than Drs. Sheppard and Ridge. So can you give a little bit of your perspective? Is there anything else that popped up during these discussions that you think is important that we should talk about?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I got my first R01 in 2015. Those were both, by the way, outstanding presentations, and a lot of what was said really resonates with me. So I might just expand on a couple of points. So with respect to the first presentation, you know, I completely agree with starting early. I think it can be really sometimes hard if you're just starting out at KO8 to start immediately thinking about what your R01 is going to be about, but I really encourage people to start thinking early and planning ahead. I ended up writing, and I, by the way, I came up with all the reasons not to do this, and my mentor really pushed me to go ahead and apply during the 3rd year of my K to write my first R01. I ended up writing 2 different R01s, and I was fortunate that I was studying a disease that affected more than one organ system, so it was relatively easy for me to try to write 2 different grants, one, you know, focusing on one organ system, one on the other. And so I submitted them both during year 3 of my K and got the reviews back and resubmitted. And that gave me time, you know, to go through that whole process to try to get an R funded before my K ran out. And since I stayed at the same institution where I did my fellowship and didn't have a startup package. So for me, securing R01 funding before my K was finished was really critical. And so by starting early, I was able to make that happen, which was really great. And in terms of just how to think about what your first R01 should be about, I think one thing that's really helpful if you have a career development award, and to the extent that you have, you know, generated data or can build on accomplishments that you've made during the course of that career development award, that makes for a really nice story that reviewers can easily latch onto when they're reviewing your first R01. In terms of the second proposal, or the second presentation rather, about Ames pages, I mean, I just couldn't agree more that, you know, that Ames page, that first page, is just such critical real estate, and I really encourage people. I know that, you know, everybody's busy and things slip in terms of your timeline, but you really, really, really want to start that page as early as possible because of several factors. One is that I think it's really helpful, particularly earlier in your career, to try to get feedback from expert grant writers. And so you want to have written that page, and you want to have revised that page and really spent time on it and gotten it as good as you can get it before you give it to a colleague who you know is really good at writing to get their feedback. And then secondly, at least in my experience, I find that iterating is really a critical part of writing. And I write and rewrite my Ames pages many times before they're finally submitted. And I think they improve significantly. I have shown some of my trainees in the past, like, all the different versions of my Ames page that evolved over the course of writing a single grant. And oftentimes I have maybe 15 or 20 versions of that page because I've just continuously rewritten it to try to get it as clear as possible. And it's so important, that one page, that every single sentence really needs to have a clear purpose, and there shouldn't be any extraneous sentences in there. Every sentence should have a purpose. And if you're reading it and the flow of ideas is not obvious and clear, then that's a signal to you that you need to revise further. So Yeah, those are really my comments, and I thought both of those presentations were excellent.
Do we have any questions from the audience at this point? We have a few in the chat. The first was, do you ever see successful Rs with only 2 aims?
Absolutely. So that's actually what I try to write now. I mean, the third aim, I agree with Karen that it's great to have to have a third aim to do things that are exciting. But I've found that my third aim often is the one that people shoot down as well. And so it's as a conservative strategy, having a grant written around 2 very well thought out aims that have multiple components to them can be a really good one. So yeah, I mean, many grants are funded with just 2 aims.
Yeah, I would concur. And I would also add that remember that NHLBI right now only funds 4-year grants. So it's very difficult to get 3 aims completed in under 4 years. So I think it's more than appropriate.
And then the next question was, does anyone have any advice about the process, presumably about writing the specific game, and I guess how to get started, or how to get yourself in a good position to start writing this?
Well, one thing is to really pay attention to the clock. So I tell everybody to start to have something that looks like specific aim at least 6 months before you're going to submit a grant. And I'm usually more aggressive about that myself, that I'll often start 8 months at least before. So that's one really important thing. There's a lot of inertia that goes on, and you look out at the deadline long in the distance and think, well, I've got plenty of time here. But because the aims page is such a critical factor in how you write the rest of the grant, that's one thing that I would really strongly emphasize. And the area that I've seen people in my lab or trainees I've mentored have the most problems with oftentimes.
Great, thank you. There is one more question, a little bit more specific question, addressing concerns when after you've submitted your first R01 and receiving feedback that maybe you don't have the seniority, you don't have first author papers, maybe you don't have the capacity to be independent. Maybe that's not something we address on the specific aims page, but in a second submission, how is that something that we would address? And I guess on the specific aims page more specifically, is there something that you might put in there?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I apologize.
Yeah, so it's there more specific concern with regard to how to address concerns after a first review of an R01, where the reviewers have said that you maybe are not senior enough or don't have enough capacity to be independent. Is there I guess there's probably other sections that you could address it in that aren't the specific aims, but more so in the specific aims, is there something that you could do that would help calm that concern?
So I think after I was pretty irate by that comment, I would call my program officer, because the role of the scientific review officer, or the SRO, is to not allow those types of comments to ever be made during study section discussions of your grant. And so the program officer's role would be to ensure that the SRO is ensuring that that type of discussion does not take place in the future. And then I would address those comments in the introduction to the grant, or the 1-page rebuttal, indicating all the things that you've achieved that would actually establish that you are, in fact, an independent investigator, such as the submission of this grant, your title, your promotions to whatever it might be. But this should never be a point of discussion or criteria for scoring your application.
I kind of agree with Karen. It made me angry too to read that comment. I do think there's some other things you can think about doing now that you have the comment, you want to respond to it. I mean, one of them is you could include a support letter from your primary mentor that also describes all the ways that what you're doing is completely different than what she or he is doing or plans to do. And then, the other thing that we should all think about as mentors is to try to encourage our trainees and encourage ourselves to be sure that our trainees write papers that we're not on. So that you can't control that completely, but to whatever extent, even if you're the first author on all the papers, if your primary mentor is not an author of your papers, it puts you in a stronger position. I'm not encouraging people to be dishonest, but I do that as a senior mentor all the time, is ask people, please don't put my name on your papers.
Thank you very much. And we'll take this as the last question for this session, but any wisdom in terms of the how to go from not being discussed to getting a decent score? And I guess from the perspective, let's try to keep it to the perspective of the specific games page if we can, if that is helpful at all. But any thoughts on that?
You don't know when you were not discussed if you were in the 51 slot, right? 50% of the grants are going to get discussed and the other remainder don't. So you don't really always know where you're at until you begin to look at your comments and your scores. And so I think, I always tell everybody, let's just put those comments away, brood for a week or 2, 3 if you have to. And then you really have to pull them out and say, what did they see that I didn't see? And you have to really begin addressing those point by point by point and improving your application based on those reviewer comments. And if you think that there was something not fair, then what I always tell my trainees is that, well, then we didn't do a good enough job writing that information. It's our job as grant writers to effectively communicate so people can understand what we're trying to propose and what experimental design we're trying to achieve. So it's the onus really ends up coming back to us as individuals.
And I would really underscore what Karen said, that you shouldn't pay attention to the score at all when you're deciding about resubmission. It's really what the concerns were. So, and you need to sometimes read between the lines. If the concerns really are that none of the reviewers thought that the area of science that you were trying to address was important, that might lead you to a conclusion of trying to work now on some different R01 proposal as your first R01. But if there are, oftentimes grants aren't scored for reasons that are very easily addressable. I mean, I'm waiting for in 2 weeks to get a score on a grant that I just resubmitted that was unscored the first time. And, I think that happens all the time. And you just don't get discouraged and view that as telling you that this is never going to work. I've seen many people put back grants that were not scored that got funded when they put them back in.
Great.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I think that the important part is not whether it was, scored or not scored so much as what were the concerns, and really trying to nail down what was it that the reviewers had problems with. And maybe the problem was that that they were confused about what you were saying. And so you need to clarify, make your writing more clear, or maybe they had some concern about the foundational data, or, so depending on what the concerns were, that's going to really dictate how you proceed.
All right. So with that, I think I want to make sure we get some time to do the small groups. So Tiana, if you can start separating us out into small groups, we basically will just go into 3 different small groups, the faculty members and members from the early career professional working group should be in all of the individual small groups. We'll review the grants, specific aims, and then we'll all come back together. All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the main room. We have a few more minutes for bigger questions if anyone had anything unanswered. If there's anything specific on your mind, thank you to everyone who participated in this session, our faculty, our ECP working group members, and thanks to all of you for sticking around. Hopefully this has been beneficial to you.
There was a question that was unanswered in the chat about whether the conclusion was that it was okay to submit an R01 grant without any senior authored papers. And I think my answer would be yes, it's definitely okay. It was a mistake for that reviewer to make that comment. And I wouldn't wait a couple of years until you have senior authored papers. That doesn't really make any sense. So yeah, it's fine. Just explain if you can, if you think it's an issue, explain how your area of research is completely different from what your mentor did. And or you might have to do that in a response to reviews, but I wouldn't wait till you have a senior author paper. I mean, early on, I think everybody should be thinking if they could have a discussion with your mentor about like taking your mentor's name off of your papers, or at least not having them be senior author on all your papers. Because even though you're not supposed to do that, I've seen it come up multiple times before.
Can I just ask you a question? Is it sufficient to have published as a first author, but without your mentor as being even on the paper? Is that just as adequate in terms of having independent ideas, independent thought?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I don't think study section members are scrutinizing who, every co-author was on your paper. I think there's many people on the study section that are a little bit of bean counters. They want to know how many first, how many last, or just how many overall publications that you've had. I think usually the counter argument to that is let's just go get quality over quantity. Absolutely. And so you're going to find that there's a lot of different voices that can be heard in a study section panel when it comes to authorship and the number of publications. But typically, quality publication always wins that argument over the quantity of lower level impact papers.
And that being said, is there a target number of publications that you're looking for like an ESI investigator? It sounds like clearly not necessarily a target, but more so impact.
Yeah, I would definitely, I don't count at all. I find it really offensive. It's really the importance of the work that's been done. So an ESI investigator who has one or two first authored papers that are impactful, that is just fine for me. Even one really good paper with ideas that come out of it is, from my point of view, is fine. There's definitely no cutoff number that anybody uses.
I would agree with that statement, Dean. And that's particularly true, and I think held in R1 study sections. At the K level study section, there's a little bit more diversity and opinion on that. And so what I can tell you, like, even though I'm a PhD, I will constantly stand up and throw myself in front of the bus when my cardiology colleagues are saying, oh, those respiratory fellows just haven't really published a lot. And I'm like, well, they were taking care of patients for the last 3 years. So I think we have to keep reminding everybody, like, this is a particular class of new investigators that's coming up who had a very different training experience than what perhaps Dean might have had when he was a fellow transitioning to being an independent investigator. And I think we just have to be mindful that this pandemic occurred and it had an impact on training and it had an impact on productivity. And if you feel the need still to put a comment like that in your bio sketch, then do so. If you were one of those fellows, that was constantly in the unit, picking up the slack for other trainees and colleagues who couldn't be in the unit as much, let me know that as a reviewer, and I'm willing to go to bat for you every time.
Maybe worth mentioning that I think you can also get extensions on your early stage investigator status for people who just spent a lot of time during COVID in the ICU and things of that nature, and also time off for maternity leave and things like that. I think can all be factors they consider in extending your ESI status.
Great. On that same vein, I guess maybe somewhat related to applying for your first R01 is the question about what things do affect your ESI status and what things don't. Dr. Sheppard, you had specifically said don't use your good ideas for something like a project grant because that might harm you and focus on an R01. But there are other opportunities to consider being a co-investigator or things like that. Can we talk a little bit about what things may or may not affect your ESI status and what things you might be able to kind of, as you're writing your R01, think about applying for?
Yeah. So I don't know all the rules. So a good rule of thumb is to always ask the NIH about it. But, before you apply, but the being a PI and a multi-PI grant, definitely if you get the grant, will use up your ESI status, and you won't get an ESI benefit from a multi-PI grant. So you don't want to put in a multi-PI grant when you have ESI status. Being a project leader on a program project grant will use up your ESI status. You can write an R21, an R03. Those won't affect your ESI status. Oh, here's somebody put in a good link.
That's actually, Dean, they actually changed the rules on that recently.
Which one did they change?
That you can be a project lead on a PPG as long as you aren't the
PI of the grant?
Yeah. And so they're actually, the mechanism now is actually to like a little bit encourage that. So you can be a project lead, but not the organizing PI. I can't remember what the name of that person is, but and the PPG actually gets quite a bit more money. And an ESI bump, and you don't spend your ESI status. You still retain it.
Okay, great. I didn't know that. That's why I started off with the caveat I didn't know all the rules, but I still wouldn't do it, honestly, because I discouraged people from putting their good ideas into PPGs when there was no ESI status. And the reason is that you're too much dependent on the overall success of that project for what happens at the end. So you want to have your first few grants from your own lab be your own, I think, personally. So I would, even whatever it does to ESI status, I wouldn't do it, but it's good to know the rules for sure.
What if, what if you're part of a collaborative project because you want to have access to the patient samples?
Yeah, of course, if you can think of benefits for doing it that outweigh the downsides, that's fine. But if you're putting your efforts into writing a project or your best independent ideas into a program project grant, that at the expense of you using those ideas for your own R01 grant, I think that's a mistake.
So Nick, I think it'd be perfectly okay to be part of a U19 that might be charged with collecting clinical samples, because the role of many U19s would be then to disperse those samples to investigators to further advance their own research. And that wouldn't impact your early stage investigator award. It would actually complement it, because then when you're putting that in your aims, you can define that you already have a role and access to those types of samples. I think the other thing we need to be mindful of is that the traditional role of the single investigator running a lab and being the only author on papers has really changed. And so there's new tracks that are different than the traditional track that I'm on, for example. And so if you're going to be in a track that's having a shared collaborative effort, then it's okay to be on multiple multi-PI grants, because that's the track of investigator track that you're on. So it's really kind of knowing what are the rules of your institution in order for you to get promoted in tenure, if that's part of your program, and what you're giving up in exchange for being on some of these multi-PI grants. And so again, I think Dean said it best: call your program officer, and they're really there to guide you through this network of different opportunities and alert you to the pros and cons to each of these choices that may have on your future potential to get funded.
Great. So we're running a little bit over time here. I want to thank everyone for participating, and those of you who stuck around. Great session, and really appreciate all the participation.